Hello, my name is Stephen Thomas, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about an issue that I ran into recently when redeploying a Logic app from VS Code into the cloud. When I would run this Logic app using Postman like I have many times before, I would get a 404 error. This error was completely and totally unexpected, and I was 100% sure I had the URL correct. Everything in VS Code looked correct, but when I deployed it, it just wouldn't execute. So let's take a look at some of the things we would want to look at and how to troubleshoot and fix this issue. It can be a challenging issue. Once you know how to fix it, it's very simple.
So let's dive into more detail about this 404 error and how I went about solving the problem. Here's a simple standard edition workflow that I created in VS Code. I went ahead and deployed this into Azure, and I was able to run it just fine. Let's take a look here. You can see here I use Postman to hit this URL. General flow of this Logic app is that I pass in a number, an order number, it calls a stored procedure, and returns the status of that order. So in this case, it is success. So let's go ahead and send it again. And this time you can see 404 not found. Now I've not changed the URL, but I have made changes to this workflow under the covers and redeployed it into Logic Apps. Everything looks fine inside of VS Code, but now for some reason I'm getting 404 and I cannot find the endpoint. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the portal. I'm now in the portal, and let's take a look at this workflow right here called Get Status. And you can see some past executions that were successful, but knowing what time it is now, I know that 4:41 was not the time I've been testing this workflow. So surely, in fact, it didn't actually hit this workflow, so the 404 seemed to be a valid response. If I double check the workflow URL, it will in fact be exactly the same. So let's dive into the designer and see if we can find anything in here. Everything looks fine in the designer, just like we saw in VS Code, but let's go ahead and do something different here, and let's add an action, and let's add a compose shape. And you can add any action. Really what I want to do is just add something to force the recompiling and revalidation of the code inside the portal here. So I'm just going to add this, just say hi. And now let's go ahead and save this. And sure enough, we got an error here. There is an error in the workflow. It says there's an issue with order ID. And that's a parameter in my stored procedure. And if I take a look, oh, sure enough, there was an @ sign added to the parameter of this stored procedure, which is something that's commonly done because most parameters, stored procedures have the @ sign in them. But in fact, input parameters do not need the @ sign. So this would be a good way to find out what your problem is. You simply force the designer in the browser to recompile the code and look at it again, and it will tell you additional errors that might not be caught in VS Code. Now, this isn't the only type of issue that can cause this 404 problem. I've seen other items that pass validation in VS Code. Once deployed into Azure, then I would see a validation error. And it surfaced itself with this HTTP endpoint as a 404. Now, there's another way to find out what the error might be. I'm going to go ahead and delete this and go ahead and discard all my changes here. So I'm not making any changes to this workflow, so it still is invalid with the @ symbol in there. And I'm just going to go to my main container for my Logic apps here and go to my Logic App Standard. And once we come over here and I click on Overview, you'll get a pop-up at the top here when it does some validation of your workflows that exist inside of this Logic app. It will say, sure enough, Get Status Validation Problem. And you'll see a similar and very useful error message here as to telling you what the problem is with that workflow. So now if we jump over to VS Code, come in here, we fix this problem. Go ahead and delete the @ sign, save it. I'm going to redeploy quickly, and we can take a look at that this is going to work now as expected. So deploy that. I'm going to pause it and come back in just a moment when deployment is complete. Okay, the deployment is complete. Let's go ahead and run this again in Postman and see what happens this time. I'm going to launch this. Let's run it again. And it gives it just a second here. Sure enough, it's working again. So now I'm able to test that Logic app using the exact same endpoint that I was using before. So the take home here is if you are running Logic App Standard, make changes locally and deploy it into Azure, and you're now getting a 404, you probably made some sort of mistake in your Logic app that wasn't caught locally, and the validation on the side with the web browser tends to be a little more complete. So I'd jump in there, open in your browser, make a change in there, and be able to see if you did in fact make a problem inside of that Logic app. So you can go ahead and fix that. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.